Well, let's bow our heads. Lord God, thank you for this time and this space to gather together to learn from one another about our community and its history and the ways in which we can both grow from this place and go out into the world and be your disciples. We are grateful for the food that we just shared, for the hands that prepared it, and for the fellowship in this place. In your son's name, amen. Amen. So I get to introduce Dr. Griffin. He is a native Charlottean whose research focuses on African American history, the history of the Black press, African Americans and World War II, and the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Since earning his doctorate in 20th century U.S. history from a school that I cannot name as a Duke fan, in 2016, he served as an assistant professor of African American history at the Citadel Military College of South Carolina and staff historian of Levine Museum of the New South. In fall 2022, he will begin serving as assistant professor of public history at UNC Charlotte. So we welcome you, Dr. Griffin. Thank you for being here today.
And I also want to thank personally Emily and Dan for inviting me to spend time with you today to talk about and discuss one of its most important stories, and that's the story of Brooklyn. So in November of 2019, Levine opened our exhibit, Brooklyn, Once a City Within a City. And Brooklyn, really, it was home to schools, churches, civic organizations, Black-owned businesses, and over 1,000 families. Brooklyn was the cultural and economic epicenter of Black Charlotte. From the late 1800s through the 1960s, this city within a city provided opportunity and sanctuary for African Americans in the segregated South. Like any city, Brooklyn was a mix of affluence and poverty, elegant homes and dilapidated apartments. It was the poverty, however, that white power brokers saw when they traveled from the wealthy neighborhoods of Myers Park to uptown. So when the post-war federal programs presented cities an opportunity to reimagine their downtown centers, Charlotte leaders saw slum clearance as a way to reclaim essentially and prized land. At the expense of Black social capital and generational wealth, urban renewal enabled white business speculators and in the mid-20th century to capitalize on prime real estate. Between 1961 and 1970, the demolition of Brooklyn raised some 216 businesses, 13 churches, 2 schools, and 1,480 homes, displacing over 7,000 residents and 1,007 families. While many former residents recall promises that they would be able to return to Brooklyn, those promises were not kept. The project dispersed families across Charlotte in search of affordable housing alternatives, and many businesses never reopened. Several churches splintered into different congregations, and court-ordered busing sent students to schools all across town. And so through this process of urban renewal, city leaders were able to bulldoze the largest Black neighborhood in the Carolinas. And many people don't really believe me when I say that, but it actually was the largest Black neighborhood in both North and South Carolina, with the exception of maybe Winston-Salem. So here you can see a portion of Brooklyn in 1958 and 1973. The same area is separated. Of course, the area in 1958 is on your left, and it's separated by a matter of 15 years. The photos give us a sense of the extent in which the area was radically transformed from a bustling neighborhood to a more sterile government and business center. You can see the landmarks here. These are the landmarks of the government center on either. And all of this area was 216 acres of neighborhood and community. So in the years following the Civil War, formerly enslaved African Americans contributed to the growth of Charlotte, establishing communities in 2 of Charlotte's 4 wards. While Second Ward and Third Wards had sizable Black populations in the by 1900, Second Ward began to emerge as the heart of Black Charlotte. Brooklyn began as Logtown, whose name reflected its meager cabins, the district's relatively less desirable and inexpensive low-lying land attracted formerly enslaved African Americans eager to establish themselves in the city. In 1886, W.R. Myers donated land at Myers and Stonewall Street to establish the first graded school for Black students in Mecklenburg County. And so the school drove the neighborhood's growth as Black families left the rural homes in North and South Carolina in search of education. And so W.R. Myers, you may recognize that name. It was his son who actually developed Myers Park. And so he was a prominent real estate landowner in the area and donated also the land where Biddle University was located, which became Johnson C. Smith. So the community continued to grow in popularity as prominent residents such as Dr. J.T. Williams, architect W.W. Smith, and physician Dr. N.B. Hauser made the district their home. At the same time, across the South and in Charlotte, racial lines began to harden. As Reconstruction gave way to Jim Crow, a campaign of white supremacy strictly enforced segregation and no longer welcomed at Charlotte's main streets, disenfranchised African Americans turned to Brooklyn. By the 1920s, Charlotte's Black Main Street in Brooklyn prospered. And over the next 3 decades, Brooklyn became the largest African American neighborhood in the Carolinas, as I just mentioned. So while it was home to some of the city's most impoverished people, Brooklyn also boasted a professional class of doctors, lawyers, teachers, ministers, community leaders, and elected officials. It was the site of Sweet Daddy Grace's annual baptism parade that was connected to the House of Prayer. It was also, it claimed Mecklenburg County's first elementary school, as I mentioned, Meyer Street Graded School, which we'll talk a little bit more when we sit down and talk with our 2 guests or our hosts. So high schools and library within Brooklyn, over 200 Black-owned businesses, from restaurants and theaters to insurance companies and funeral homes thrived. So next, I want to show you a map that gives us detail of the concentration of Black residents. These, you can barely see the numbers, but this is First Ward, Second Ward, Third Ward, and Fourth Ward. And the darker dots represents the Black population. Between 1895 and the creation of this map in 1917, the Black population in Second Ward rose from 57 to 82%. The white population mainly occupied the areas up around Trade and Tryon Street here. And so this map came from the John Nolan papers at Cornell University. When we started doing the research, we couldn't figure out why a map of Charlotte ended way up in upstate New York at Cornell. But next, I just want to show you some images of what we talk about anchors of the Black community. This is an image of the AME Zion Publishing House. And so the AME Zion church leaders relocated the publishing house to Charlotte in 1894. And this was the headquarters of the National AME Zion. And it really became the intellectual center for Black political and spiritual life in the South. It published not only the Star of Zion, which was perhaps the most important Black newspaper in the country at the time, because it published both news and secular and non-secular news, and it was widely distributed around the country. It also published other newspapers like the Progressive Messenger. And for those of you who are interested in exploring African-American history in Charlotte, you can find Colored Charlotte on the internet. It is a booklet that was published in I believe 1915. It was 50 years after emancipation. And it displays all of the accomplishments that African Americans had been able to achieve in the city. So if you get an opportunity to search for that on the internet, it's really informative. Another anchor of the community in 1906 was built the Brevard Street Library, which began serving Black Charlotteans. Librarian Lydia Shink raised money to provide furniture and books not covered to share by the share of the Andrew Carnegie Grant, which managed by the city alderman. And so the Carnegie Foundation, we all know, built libraries all across the country, and they built 3 here in Charlotte. Pictured here are members of the Ramesses Temple Local Lodge of Prince Hall Shriners in 1944. And these fraternal orders played an important role in the Black community. This is an image of the Savoy Theater. It was one of 2 Black theaters in Brooklyn. The Royal Theater first opened in 1927, and it took the name of Savoy 2 years later. It was a rare that theaters for African Americans could sit where they wanted. The Savoy served the Black community until it was demolished by urban renewal in 1963. And you see it says air conditioned, so it was one of the first theaters that provided air conditioned seating for African Americans. And this is an image you probably all recognize. It's one of the, I think, only 2 buildings that still survive from Brooklyn. This is the Mecklenburg Investment Company. It was constructed in 1921 by local leaders, Cesar Blake, W.W. Smith, Thad Tate, and J.T. Williams. And so the building still stands at Brevard and 3rd Street. And it's provided doctors and dentists, lawyers, and other professional spaces to operate their businesses. And so those of you who go on the walking tour, you'll be able to see this image as well as the Brevard Street Library and where the Savoy used to sit. This is the Alexander Funeral Home owned by Zachary Alexander. And so it's Black businesses like this that gave independence to community leaders who were willing to speak out against segregation. His son, Fred and Kelly Alexander, advocated for Brooklyn residents during urban renewal. And so these are some of the other churches. Grace Amy Zion were founded in 1886, and this was again one of the only 4 buildings that remain in Brooklyn. And so the church remained a long time after urban renewal. It didn't leave that area until 2006, so it had a 117-year existence at that corner. It finally relocated to the university area. And so these are some other important churches. St. Paul Baptist Church, which at the time of urban renewal was the largest Black church in the community. And it was one of the churches that splintered off into several. My great-grandfather was the custodian of St. Paul for a number of years. And as well as we all know Friendship is perhaps the largest Black church in the city today.
Where was St. Paul Baptist Church located?
I'm not sure exactly.
McDowell Street.
McDowell Street.
On McDowell.
And we'll talk a little bit because I think Mr. Archie was a member of St. Paul.
Is St. Paul's in South Belmont?
It is. I think it's in Belmont right now, yes.
Yeah, that was one of the spin-offs you alluded to.
One of the spinoffs you alluded to.
Yes, that's one of them. I'm not sure what the other churches it broke off into, but it became one of those congregations. So this is the original house of prayer for all people, built in 1929. Bishop Charles Manuel Sweet Daddy Grace established a branch of the United House of Prayer for All People in Brooklyn. Whether they attended church or not, scores of residents participated in the annual convocation parade that marched through Uptown to the Mother House on McDowell Street. Though this location no longer exists, the Mother House also relocated to Badersford Road. And so there were 3 other additional churches that the House of Prayer splintered off into. And 2 more pictures. So this is an image that we all should recognize. I think Second Ward High School. I think the gymnasium is the only part of that building that still stands today. And it opened as Mecklenburg County's first high school in 1923. Up until 1923, if you were African American and wanted a high school education, you had to attend Biddle University, which had a high school department. So during urban renewal, Black leaders discussed converting the facility into a magnet school, but following court-ordered desegregation, the school board closed the school rather than integrate it. And so 50 years later, Second Ward High School remains a source of pride for among community members. I think they have a national alumni association, and that's really unheard of in many high schools. And I added this picture. This is a picture of my uncle, Thomas Griffin, which we'll talk a little bit. Bill Harris actually knew my uncle. I was surprised when I showed up. He was the captain of the 1953 football team. And I think this year, West Charlotte actually edged them out in the Queen City Classic. So for those in West Charlotte, I know. I also taught at West Charlotte, so my loyalties are split. And finally, again, I mentioned this at the top, Meyer Street Graded School is really what brought a lot of African Americans to Charlotte from the rural countryside to South Carolina. This is an image of the school in 1915, and this is an image that you'll find in the book that I was telling you about online, Colored Charlotte. The community affectionately called this school, Meyer Street Graded School, Jacob's Ladder. And so this kind of biblical reference to the school, you can see the stairs on the outside of the school. And so day in, day out, African-American children climb these stairs, believing that education would deliver them from all of the poverty and racism and other kinds of discrimination that they faced. But it was in 1929, this is an article from the Afro-American newspaper, written by a journalist, local journalist, Trezvon Anderson, who I'm writing a biography about right now with Vanderbilt University Press. This is actually beginning when African Americans began organizing around issues that were affecting their community. The school had been overcrowded for some time. And down here in the corner is the new school that was actually built in 1932. After the African-American community began demanding that city leaders provide funding for a new school. So we often think that African-Americans began to express their concern around inadequate education in the 1950s, but here in Charlotte, it was much earlier. And so now that's the end of the presentation I have. And now I'm going to ask Mr. Bill Harris and Mr. Archie to come on up and join us, and we'll talk a little bit. Let me stop sharing our screen.
That sounds good. Okay.
Okay, so I figured the way that we should go is because Mr. Archie, Mr. Harris actually, has a longer history in Brooklyn. And
Are you saying I'm the
not necessarily. I'm just saying that you spent a lot of time in Brooklyn as a teacher. And I ended with the Meyer Street Graded School. It was, again, a really important anchor in Brooklyn. And you started teaching at Meyer Street Graded School in the 1950s. And so I wanted you to share with the audience a little bit about your history and then how you got into education, and then talk about your experience at Meyer Street Graded School.
Well, thank you very much. Let me also thank First Press for focusing a bit on Brooklyn. I wonder, why were you doing it? Whatever the reason, I want to express appreciation to you for just focusing on a section of the city that no longer exists, but nevertheless was one of the most important in the history of the city. I had the pleasure of attending Meyer Street School, and I can vividly remember my first grade teacher saying to me, you're going to be a teacher, and you're going to be a principal. And I didn't believe either one of those, but how prophetic she was. I not only attended Maya Street, by the way, which was about 4 blocks from where I lived. I not only attended there, but I had to be a good boy because my aunt taught there at the time I was going there, and members of my church taught there, so I couldn't get away with a darn thing. But it was at Maya Street. We had what I would call the real extended family. The teachers there were teachers, of course, but they were like aunts. They were like grandmothers, and they wanted to make very sure that you understood the importance of education. Once I finished college, and by the way, I didn't want to go to college, but that's another story. Once I finished college, in my last year of college, I had an opportunity to go back and do my practice teaching at Maya Street. We were on the quarter system at the time. I did my practice teaching there, my first quarter. And before the end of my practice teaching, I signed a contract to teach there the following year. So I went through 2 years, my last 2 years college, knowing that I had a job at Maya Street. So that, I can't tell you how pleased I was to have that opportunity.
So, Mr. Archie, you also attended Maya Street. Could you talk a little bit about your experience there?
Well, I attended there when I grew up in the area, and I went to elementary school there for a couple of years. And what I remember is about the same. I mean, he went at a different time, but when I came along, it was exactly the same way. You couldn't get away with nothing. Everybody in the church either went to your church, everybody at the school either went to your church out there, or I had like family there, and I had to be on my best behavior all the time. You know what I'm saying? If I wasn't, believe me, I got a spanking from everybody, and then got home and had to get 2 more spankings. So that wasn't it like that? Exactly like that. But what I remember about it is that from the first day I went to school, and I also went to kindergarten at St. Paul Baptist Church, which was right across the street, and they was teaching the same thing, that education was the most important thing, and the only way we were gonna get, we had to be twice, pardon my expression, twice as good as most white people. We had to be twice as good as them, and we had to get the education to stand out from everybody else. So we learned that I learned that from kindergarten all the way to when I went to Maya Street. Then when I went to, you see Mr. Williams up there, J.T. Williams, I also went to junior high school at the school that was named after him. And it was preached to me the whole time. So I mean, I knew by the time I got to high school, when it integrated the schools, that I knew how I had to be.
So I'd like to add to, my son attends J.T. Williams Montessori School right now, so it's a good connection. But what I would like to say about this, so the audience understands, is that this is prior to integration, and in the Black community, the best and brightest of the communities were teachers, and so they made sure that the students who attended those schools were able to go out into society and take care of themselves because they knew that they represented the community. So if I could get you to talk a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Brooklyn, and then we'll come back to Mr. Archie and talk about your experience, Mr. Harris.
That was the love of my life. Brooklyn, I knew nothing else. You see, I didn't know that I was poor. I didn't know that I was disadvantaged. I didn't know that I lived in a blighted community. I knew that I lived in a community that was loving. I knew that I lived in a community that was caring. I knew that I lived in a community that believed in the work ethic. So these are things that, I was taught growing up. You've gotta be, as you indicated, you gotta be the best you can be. You've got to be respectful of the elderly. You gotta love work. You gotta value time. These are things that were ingrained in me as I was coming along.
Well, it's just like, what he was saying, when my parents, they grew up over there, I mean, I can tell you the real truth about it. I was in the second grade, in Brooklyn, I really didn't see anybody white in the neighborhood. I mean, that's the only thing I knew. I mean, we had everything there. We had stores, we had shops that buy clothes, we had movie theaters. So we didn't have, there was no sense in us leaving that neighborhood. So, I enjoyed it. I mean, like I said, it was a strange thing. I mean, once I got out of the neighborhood, started staying someplace else, I really didn't see too many white people. I integrated to school, really. I did. Integrated to schools when I went to my 9th and 10th grade year. George McMillan integrated to schools. I mean, that's the first time I had even dealt one-on-one with anybody white. So I never knew nothing. And like he said, my neighborhood was loving. I mean, people cared about you, you know what I'm saying? And if you out of line and you doing something wrong, I mean, you couldn't go nowhere in the neighborhood where anybody know you. And you say, well, you don't need to be doing that, And I think when I got older, I appreciate that more. I appreciate it more.
Again, and so for some context, so that we understand, when we talk about Brooklyn, mostly in Charlotte, the first thing that comes up is slum area, and we have to understand that in order for urban renewal, the process to take place, government officials had to first convince the larger community that it was blighted and it was slum. But it was a city within a city, and what we found at Levine is that over half of the residents owned their homes, and they were really nice homes. These were not just blighted homes. Folks like J.T. Williams and Dr. Hauser, they were elegant homes. Again, if I can remind you to go back to Colored Charlotte, that on the internet and find that booklet, you'll see the kinds of homes that were in Brooklyn. And so what you begin to notice is the newspapers around the early 1950s, they began to point out all of the slums and the blighted areas, but these were mostly absentee landlords who owned rental homes and refused to fix them up. And so that's why it became associated with just blight.
I never thought of it as urban renewal. I thought of it as urban removal. Because you talk about the homes. My grandmother, who picked cotton in order to buy her home. And by the way, I was passing the courthouse recently, and I thought about her because she would pick cotton, and the little money that she would make, 50 cents, she'd walk from Morris Street to that courthouse. It wasn't courthouse then, to deposit her money so that she could save enough over time to buy a home, which she did on Morris Street, and it was not a blighted facility or home. So when I think about this time, and by the way, when you talk about Brooklyn, when you want to get my eye up, you think about You think about the homes that were destroyed, the people's lives that were destroyed, businesses not blighted, the 20 so churches that were demolished. By the way, our churches were demolished, but you know the one church that was able to come move in there? First Baptist. First Baptist. And you know, we were talking earlier about the UNC oral history thing. And that was one of the things that I focused on. I was very bitter because of what they did to a community of loving people, caring people, people who were not able to defend for themselves, but they did that in the interest of progress with a little t.
Oh, I can remember my parents talking about it when we was having to move. All my father would talk about is, all my family's over there, I don't know where, I don't want to move, you know. And my mother would say, well, you know what they're talking about, urban renewal. She said, it's not urban renewal, it's urban moving us out, because they don't want us here, you know. And after, you know, after years of having to move out of there, I was thinking when I got a little older, I said, yeah, that's exactly what it was. That was exactly what it was, because they were just wanting to take over everything in that area. Because then the downtown wasn't like it was now. I mean, it was just a little small place with a built department store and highways, and they was wanting to get all that together. That's what I saw out of it. And you know, when the people moved, I mean, they did build urban renewal housing, Double Oaks, Fairview Homes, and a lot of the doctors and lawyers that stuff moved to University Park, but you know, it wasn't like all of us staying in the same place. Wasn't the same.
You know, one of the things that I vividly remember, a house in which I lived, grew up, was a row house. It was on Stonewall Street, 1020 Stonewall Street. In order to make room for what is now Independence Boulevard, they put those houses on rollers and they rolled them back. And they built a little wall with steps going up to the house. And I thought, well, you know, if they're going to renew this area, when are they going to start building? It was years, literally years, before they did anything with that area. We moved, my wife and I moved to New Jersey. And at Christmas time, we'd come back. I'd drive down into that area because it was such a, you know, I cared so much about the area. I would drive there and I would drive down by, down Independence Boulevard, and those stairs were still there. Years and years later, they were still there. They're not there now, but I thought so much for urban renewal, so much for progress.
I should add some context, because when you talk about history, context is very important. Now, Charlotte was not the only place to experience urban renewal. Just about every major urban city in the country went through this process of urban renewal. But Mr. Archie talked about the splintering of the Black community. This was the beginning of this stratification of the classes of African Americans. Mr. Harris talked about being able to walk through the city, through Brooklyn, and see people from all walks of life doing a number of things. So you could find people who were doing promising things that you could aspire to be. But in order for urban renewal to take place in Charlotte, city leaders first had to convince homeowners to sell their homes so that they could establish neighborhoods like University Park. They promised the homeowners that they were building communities that they could have yards and they didn't have to deal with the blight because African Americans themselves did not like to see, they wanted to see their community renewed. And African Americans went to city meetings, hoping that government officials would do that. But first they convinced middle-class African Americans that they could move and have new communities. And then and only then could they establish the community as blighted after those middle-class African Americans had sold their homes. And so it was a complex process, and I tried to get people in Charlotte to not think of it as yes, African Americans, their social capital was taken away from them, but they were offered money. If you owned a home, you got a good offer for that home. And it was capitalism that they most often were lowballed. But if they were able to get a representation, they got more money. And for renters, they often offered moving fees, which is unheard of. In the process of taking eminent domain. You never hear people being offered funds to move. So it was a complex process, but I think context is really important. So would you like to?
I have a question. Do you think, was there ever an intent to do what they said they were gonna do? Like, we're gonna make this, we're gonna get rid of the blight, we're gonna revitalize and revamp, or do you think all from the very beginning it was just a ruse and they were not, okay. I didn't know if maybe it changed along the way, and once they got the homeowners out, they thought, wow, now we have this. But from the very beginning, it was just to get
in our research, we never found the Urban Renewal Redevelopment Corporation admit in writing that they were going to rebuild Brooklyn. And so a lot of the people that we interviewed said that they were promised verbally that that would happen. But I think city officials made sure never to put that in writing. So like Mr. Harris said, I don't think that was ever intended.
Yeah, that was a promise, I think, to rebuild Second Ward. Never happened, never intended to happen. I think we just have to use this expression, call a spade a spade.
How much opposition was there to raising Brooklyn? Was there opposition among white elected officials, among the leaders of the Brooklyn community, elected officials or otherwise? Did that go anywhere?
I never heard, that's a very good question. I never heard a bit about opposition to raising Brooklyn.
So
Were there any legal challenges?
There were no legal challenges, but the opposition appeared in the form of folks like Kelly Alexander, and who at that time had reestablished the NAACP, Reginald Hawkins. They all appeared before these meetings about urban renewal. And as I said, they wanted the renewal to take place, but they did not want the community to be stripped away from African Americans. And they always demanded that new housing be built somewhere in the city for them. And that also became an issue.
I thought the question was, I might have misinterpreted. Were you asking about white persons?
Both.
Yeah.
Both, either within the Black community in Brooklyn or the white elected officials. No one spoke out much saying, wait a minute, I vote against this, or
No.
it's not right, or.
No, not white elected officials, but you're right, Kelly Alexander, Fred Alexander, Reginald Hawkins, they were on the forefront. And they were objecting not to progress, but to the way this whole thing unfolded.
Now we found maybe one lone voice coming from the white community that was in opposition because of the idea of property owner, messing with property owners, and they had rights. But overwhelmingly, the folks who led the urban renewal process were businessmen, speculators, real estate, and they saw dollar signs. All around the country, center city properties were, becoming much more expensive, and these ideas of high rises and these shiny buildings, it represented dollars. So, yeah. That's a great question, though.
What about the history of the name Brooklyn as the neighborhood? Is that a self-defined name? Was it, because obviously you think of New York.
Right.
Well, in fact, it was named after New York. New York, Brooklyn being self-contained and vibrant. After the Logtown name, people started to refer to it as Brooklyn.
It was really by the 1920s, around 1890, the turn of the 20th century. If you read most newspapers, it was a big story across the country that New York City was considering incorporating Brooklyn into the city. And for a long time, African Americans had well aware of this long history of free African American population at Brooklyn. And so you see African American communities all around the South adopt that name. There was a Black community in Wilmington. There's one in Salisbury that also took the name, but there are also names like Harlem. But by the 1920s, Brooklyn became synonymous with urban development, urban growth. And so it was really by the 1920s that Brooklyn had been cemented as the name of this Black community.
I wonder if there's any comments on Brooklyn Presbyterian Church. So I thought you were a member of that.
I was a member of Brooklyn Presbyterian. In fact, I've been a Presbyterian all my life. I grew up in Brooklyn Presbyterian, which was formed in 1911. That was another thing that bothered me to no end. In fact, I said to Sue, I was asked to introduce myself at one time, and I said that I'm the boy that never was, because my home, the home in which I was born, was raised. My elementary school demolished, my church demolished, my high school demolished, my neighborhood demolished, the people that I grew up with dispersed. So you think about that. There are lots of people who become hardened and very, very bitter about that. I have some feelings about it, but you can't let that consume you. But getting back to the church, Brooklyn Presbyterian was a church that was built by the people, by the members. And it was the Catawba Presbytery agreed to the name Brooklyn, and which occurred in 1911. We were there until Urban Renewal said, you gotta go. And it was tragic because the membership of that church, while we had a few professionals in there, most of the members were people who did menial jobs. They didn't have enough money to go out and compete with First Baptist to rebuild in that area. So what we ended up having to do after looking at all of our options, we ended up merging with 7th Street Presbyterian, which is now First United Presbyterian, which you know pretty well because of our relationship with First Pres.
I tried to find images of Brooklyn Presbyterian, but I could not find one.
I can show you one. No, actually, and I say that sincerely, there is something called the Brooklyn Story. And I'll share this with you afterwards. And there is an image of Brooklyn Presbyterian. It reminds me in a sense of Maya Street because our steps went up just like the Jacob's Ladder. But yeah, that's a church that will forever remain in my heart.
Tell me about city services in Brooklyn. I mean, I'm assuming it was within the city of Charlotte. So police, fire, roads, water, sewer.
Well, up until the 1940s, they didn't have any of those services. Most of the streets remained unpaved until the 1940s. In the 1940s, you began to see the Black community organizing, demanding African-American representation of the police force. Because you can imagine, they didn't have any streetlights in Brooklyn. And so crime was reported often in Charlotte Observer and Charlotte News as being high in Brooklyn. But the Black community, always voiced their opposition to the portrayal of crime in the community when the city refused to provide streetlights or police officers. And so for the first few years that the police were finally added to the force in the mid-1940s, they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have cars to patrol, and they had badges and were only allowed to carry nightsticks, and they were never allowed to arrest any whites in the city. And so they didn't get those amenities from the city until post-World War II. And that's when Charlotte really became, as it is now with the future planning of the city, they became really committed to that. And that's when you begin to see city officials talking about what the city was going to look like in the future. And they always added a tacked on after section that was represented as the Black community or Negro community, what was going to happen there. And so they were represented in these meetings and they would talk about their desires for the community. But that was only, by the late 1940s, less than a decade later, we're talking about urban renewal.
I want to say something that's contradictory. You talk about the crime that was there. There were people in Brooklyn who were ornery, but the crime rate in Brooklyn at that time was not as high as many people reported.
Again, I'm saying this is what the newspapers report. So, and we know about the media. The media's role was always to direct the larger population's beliefs about the community. So you're probably very.
Yeah, we did not have, right now, many of the crimes are associated with drugs. You did not find drugs in Brooklyn. There was alcohol. You didn't find guns. I don't know, I did not know. You might know of people who own guns. That just wasn't a prevalent thing in Brooklyn.
No, they had knives and, they had like a lot of liquor houses, after hour houses and stuff like that. You might have fights and stuff like that. And I remember seeing those when I was a kid. But as far as people getting stuck up and people getting rolled for their money and stuff like that, people didn't have that much, so they couldn't roll them. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you roll with somebody that's probably got less than you.
Exactly.
I mean, you couldn't do that because there wasn't nothing to see. So
right. I remember my next door neighbor, lovely couple, just absolutely great. Mr. Jess and Miss B. Great during the week. On the weekend, they loved to drink. And boy, did they argue. I mean, you could hear all over the neighborhood. And I said to myself at that time, if this is what alcohol makes people do, I don't want to drink. And I never developed the taste for alcohol. But thanks, Miss. Oh, gosh.
Doctor, I've got a real estate question. I always assumed that Brooklyn was taken by eminent domain And you made reference to homeowners, property owners selling when they got the right price. I'm assuming now that there was a mix of that, but if it was taken by eminent domain, it's taken by the municipality. I mean, how do people profit from that?
So, I mean, for a long time, the areas you see was left without any development. But as I mentioned, first they had to approach the homeowners before they even initiated the process of urban renewal. And so by first approaching Black homeowners who would have the option of purchasing homes in what were really nice communities, University Park, Oakland, Macquarie Heights, Dalebrook, these new developments were on par with the white communities that were being established on the south side of the city. And so once those Black homeowners had sold their homes, now they approached the rental home owners. And a lot of times they would live outside of the city, out of the state. And once they agreed to sell, then the renters were left without any options. And so there were very little instances of actual eminent domain being issued. And most often, as Mr. Harris said, it dealt with road widening at McDowell Street, the building of Independence to put up the wall so the power brokers did not have to look at the blight. On Brevard Street, the widening of Brevard Street, it took portions of AME Zion, Grace AME Zion, they purchased for $100. The Alexanders home, owned their family home, they took portions of that when they widened the street and paid the family $100. So eminent domain really wasn't an issue in that.
They didn't call it eminent domain, they just called it making you an offer that you can't refuse, or you better not refuse. And I know that happened in case of my, again, my grandmother, who had to sell.
Right.
And thank God my father my mother and father had thought ahead to what was likely to happen. So they ended up buying a home on the west side and didn't have to wait until the house was raised.
Yeah, and so in the exhibit, we found a lot of homeowners, or quite a few, who were able to get legal representation and push back against the original offer. Like Frank Manigo, who I think his family was the last family to leave Brooklyn. His father was a drywaller, a contractor, so he understood the value of homes. And they got a lawyer to represent them. And I think they got a 13% increase in the original offer. But you also saw the same thing with the rental property owners. There was one person, I think they owned 40 rental spaces, and I think they live in Arlington, South Carolina. And they were offered something that they considered low, a low figure, and they got legal representation and got more as well. So there were situations like that. There was some negotiation going on.
How many of the rental property owners were white as a percentage?
The majority of them.
All okay.
Yeah, the majority of them. But I will say this about Black Charlotte. Again, with the erasure or raising of Brooklyn, it not only took away a community, it erased the history of Black Charlotte. And many of the more affluent African Americans in the city made their money through real estate. They invested in real estate. Folks like J.T. Williams, the image of the lawyer in front of the sign, he was perhaps one of the largest real estate investors in the city. Who he started a bank at the turn of the 20th century to help African Americans who wanted to purchase homes. And so all around the city, these what they call villages popped up that allowed African Americans to purchase homes. Places like Billingsville, which became Greertown and now Greer Heights. It was one of the first communities outside of Brooklyn where African Americans could purchase homes. So home ownership and real estate investment has always been a big thing in the Black community. And because of that history being raised, that history is gone. We don't understand that. I think that we're out of time now. I think.
Thank you very much to Kenny and to Bill and to Dr. Griffin for such a fascinating, enlightening look at our community. And I think all of us learned a lot. So we really appreciate you being here, and I think they deserve another huge round of applause. So now, walkers, after Mary Margaret closes us in prayer, you might want to consider visiting the restrooms on the corridor going off the historic lobby. Then go outside, form small groups, 4 to 6, pick up a map and a bottle of water, and have fun. One important note, the church will be locked this afternoon, but Luther will be at the reception desk from 2:15 to 2:30. Another possibility is to visit somewhere serving brunch. If you need a little quick stop, McCormick and Schmidt, you can talk them into it. But anyway, thank you all so much from the Plowshares Committee for being here. It was wonderful to be in person again. And just, it was a really terrific afternoon, and I'm so glad you all could join us. So thank you so much, and thank you for fixing this mic. Mary Margaret.
I think I missed her, but I also wanted to thank Shantiqua, who I think is part of your group, and who we had a reception for today. She's leaving to go to the bank, so sorry, I think she was there, but missed her. So, but thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I'm born and raised in Charlotte, and things you didn't know. So let's have a prayer. Lord God, we are again grateful for the stories and our history and the way in which we might grow and learn from one another and grow in faith. We pray for blessings for those who are going out walking and exploring our community today, that you bless their footsteps and you bless their learning and you bless this community in the ways that we might affect change in a positive way to become the world that you intended us to be. In your son's name, amen.
Amen.